September was National Prepping Month, but it's October and we're still going to talk about prepping, specifically how to prepare for what happens in your home if you lose electricity. Considering sources of backup power is super important. Unfortunately, it's often something that people don't think about until they are actually in the situation where they don't have any power. I was recently reminded, I was getting ready to write the script for this video, and I remembered that my friend Brenda, 10 months ago in January, a freak snowstorm went through their area, really heavy snow followed by ice. Huge tree limbs down. They were without power for 7 days. Now, she and her husband, Mark, live in a tiny home, well, actually a tiny bus, and they thought they were pretty well prepared, but they found out like the thermometer was like consistently below freezing, and by the time they got to the end of the 7 days, then the temperature in their tiny bus was hovering somewhere in the 40s. And so I called her and I said, hey, what's going on? You remember when that thing happened in January? And she said, it is so weird that you should contact me, because she said, I'm literally out running errands. And as you are talking to me, the first raindrops of Hurricane Ian are hitting my windshield right now. They're telling us, be prepared for power outages. But she said the really great thing was that she and Mark now feel like they were completely confident and ready to weather the storm, so to speak, and get through some expected power outages. She said there were 3 main things they actually had figured out from going through the storm in January. Those 3 things were they needed to figure out how much backup power they needed, how they were going to supply that backup power, and the third really important thing people don't think about either is they tested those backup power supplies before Hurricane Ian was actually headed in their direction. Those 3 points are actually what we're going to talk about in this video. But if you don't know us, if this is your first time with us, let us introduce ourselves.
I'm Larry.
And I'm Hope.
And we're from Under the Median, where every week we talk about practical frugality.
Now we're going to delve right into the topic at hand, but I just thought about something else. I mentioned to you just now that Brenda and her husband Mark live in a tiny home, actually tiny bus. She wrote a book about the experience of downsizing from a very large home. I think it was like 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath, something like that, to the bus. And she actually did that downsizing in 30 days. She wrote a best-selling book about it. So if that's where you're at right now, if you're like, need to downsize, need to simplify, need to become a minimalist, you might want to check out her book. Just in case you want to look at it, I'll make sure there's a link to Brenda's book in the description of the video. And now back to helping you to figure out your needs for backup power.
The first thing you need to ask yourself is, how long of a power outage are you planning for? We did a little research on it, and we found out that for non-catastrophic events, the average power outage is only 2 hours. Now, you probably don't need to do a lot if you're going to be without power for 2 hours. The problem is when the power goes out, you don't know how long it's going to be out.
We actually have had, and we live in town, we've had power outages a couple of times since we've lived here that are 3-day stretches at a time. What happened was an unexpected storm came through, much like Brenda's situation, and it knocked over power poles. They fell like dominoes up the street. And so not only did the power company need to replace one power pole, but they couldn't give us power until they'd started from where they actually started falling and cracking in half.
That was a part of a kind of a freak storm that happened in August. They have a special name for the winds, but it's basically a 65-mile-an-hour straight line wind came through, and it hit particularly in our neighborhood. I was at the library and saw it come in. By the time I got home, we were without power.
Now, our power outage was 3 days, but the people who were actually toward the top of the hill where we live, where they had to repair all 3 or 4 power poles before they could get energy back again. They were without power for 5 days living in town. Statistically, actually, if you live in the country, your power outages are going to last longer than those of us who live in the city. Now, the one thing we do want to interject here is, let's say that you're like, look, I got a minimum amount of time, minimum amount of money, minimum amount of space to store backup power type supplies. No worries. What we want you to do is think about, what can you do if you're out for 2 hours? What can you do if you're out for 24 hours? What can you do if you're out for 2 or 3 days? Just sort of planning and knowing ahead of time what you can do is going to help take a lot of that strain off of you when the power goes out, so you don't panic.
And the key thing that Hope said was preparing ahead of time. We had so many neighbors that abandoned their home. They moved into a hotel or a motel for a few days. Their food all went bad. They suffered quite a bit of loss because they had not prepared for a power outage.
Hey, speaking of moving, other than considering the length of power outage that you're planning for, and whether you live in the town, whether you live in the city, you might want to consider whether, if something catastrophic happens, do you anticipate that perhaps your grown kids are going to want to come and stay with you, maybe with your grandkids? If you think something happens, then extended family is going to be coming home for a period of time, then you might want to make sure that you have a little additional backup power supplies on hand, because you might actually be using more power than you think you would.
In the case of Brenda and Mark with their catastrophic storm, it caused roads to be closed and they couldn't get anywhere. They couldn't get to their parents who didn't have power, and the dad was on oxygen. So this was kind of a serious event. So you may not be able to get in and out, or your family may not be able to come over. So they may need to be prepped as well. Well, let's kind of rewind a little bit and start talking about some of the terms that we've been throwing out. For instance, what is power? Power is an electrical measurement, usually the amount of watts that an appliance or an item will use. It's the usage power. So you need to know that number in order to know how much you need to supply for that item that you need. Let's just take a LED light bulb. An LED light bulb typically uses around 10 watts. Actually, I'm finding in measurements they use a little less than 10 watts, but that's not very much power, so you don't need anything real big for that. Your toaster may use about 1,300 watts. A microwave can be 1,500, 1,600 watts. And your average coffee maker is right around 1,000 watts. And 1,000 watts is a kilowatt. So when you hear kilowatt, kilo just means 1,000. So when you put kilo ahead of watt, then you're just talking about 1,000 watts, or increments of 1,000.
We can often find terms confusing. For instance, we're talking about power, but when you talk about energy, energy usage is measured in kilowatt hours, and that's the usage that you find on your utility bill. So that explains what that is. Now we know that for the purpose of backup power, what you need to know about the appliances and the items that you need to use and are most important to you, you need to know how much they use in watts. You need to know their power usage. By the time you get done with this video, you're actually going to walk away with a blueprint of sorts that will tell you exactly what items you need to power in your home and how much power you need to supply for them. But before we get to that, we just said what power is, but there's something else super important you need to know, and that is that some items actually require something called startup power.
Or it can be called surge power or surge energy. You'll notice when you look at generators, they'll say maybe it's rated at 3,500 watts and it'll surge to 5,000. Well, why is that important? Anything that uses an electric motor, like your sump pump, your compressor on your refrigerator or air conditioning unit, a heavy fan, I'm talking about a pretty big whole house type fan, if it's got like a 1/2 or 1/3 horse motor, then that has a substantial amount of surge power that you have to take into consideration. Well, how do you figure that? Well, first you need to figure out how much does that item use as its normal rate of consumption. We found out that our sump pump uses about 350 watts when it's running, but on startup, it's going to be 2 to 3 times that amount. And I might say that that's a very difficult thing to measure. You can measure the running watts pretty easily, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit. But the surge power, it's a little hard to track that down. And the device that we're going to talk about doesn't really measure surge power because it happens too quick for that item to respond. So anything that has a motor, just multiply it by 2 or 3, and you'll know how much headroom to leave on that item.
Whenever you get ready to figure out which items you really need to power during a power outage, you need to make sure that you have a list and that list is prioritized. In other words, the things that are most important to you are going to go right at the top of that list. And those are the items you absolutely have to make sure that you supply power to. Now, the first thing that you might want to consider are medical type devices. Do you have a CPAP machine? Are you on oxygen? Do you have an electric scooter or perhaps a wheelchair? Are there any devices that you need medically? Those are the items that really need to be absolutely at the top of that list.
And you should know ahead of time how much power those consume. For instance, an electric wheelchair, you need to know how much power does it take to recharge it? How much does it draw from your line circuit? A lot of times it'll say in the owner's manual how much power it uses, but you can measure that very accurately if you have a kilowatt meter. When we lost power during the rather freak ice storm a few years ago, the ground was saturated. It was totally wet. We were thawing out from a lot of fall and winter precipitation. And so the sump pump was running full time. And when the power went out, the very first thing that I dived into was getting that sump pump hooked up, and we got it hooked up just in time before it overflowed. So that became the priority. You might want to consider other items of priority, like your refrigeration, your freezers, your refrigerators. If you don't want to lose food and suffer a loss there, then you're going to need to supply power for them. So there are a lot of things to take into consideration on what you need. Of course, maybe some other needs would be lighting and cooking items, and maybe your computer, so you kind of know what's going on. But in order for the computer to work, your modem is going to have to be activated. So there's a lot of things to take into consideration.
Now, the other thing to consider with a modem is the fact that that may very well be your lifeline, so to speak, to the outside world and knowing what's going on, what the repair time is approximated to be by your utility company, keeping in touch with loved ones. We saw this, Hurricane Ian came through, and we saw people who were marking themselves safe on Facebook. So loved ones knew that they were okay during that storm. There may be situations where you want to make sure you're able to have that communication to reach out to loved ones and let them know that you're actually safe. So your modem might actually be super important to supply power to.
If it's a pretty large area-wide power outage, your modem may not work because there may not be power behind that for the company that supplies that service. So in that case, you might want to have an emergency radio on hand. And we've got a really nice radio that we've purchased that we use. That way you can at least get local news and headlines and further weather reports to see what's coming in. Of course, your phone, you can get that powered out. Phones don't really take a lot of power, so a little portable USB battery bank might be good enough just to supply a little charge for that. You know, you can always take it out to your car and charge it too if you've got a 12-volt USB plug that you can plug into the cigarette lighter port on your car.
Speaking of those USB power ports, there's actually a number of ways that you can supply power for these items. Now, of course, all of the things that we're getting ready to mention, they're not unlimited power sources. You somehow, sometime down the road, need to have the ability to recharge or supply gasoline or fuel to these items, which are supplying your backup power needs. It can be anything from a dedicated whole house generator to a portable power station to perhaps some solar type generated power. We're not going to get into that in this video, but what we are going to do is we have had lots of questions about, I see these portable power supplies that are offered. I literally don't know exactly what they will power and what they will not power and how I make a decision on which one is right for me. So a week from today, next Monday, we're actually going to do a video that compares 3 different sizes of portable power stations. They're all by the same manufacturer. We're going to show you what they will power, what they won't power, how long that power will last, and hopefully that's going to help you to sort of sort through all of those options and know which one might be the best option for your family. So the best way not to miss that video.
The best way not to miss it is to be a subscriber and also to hit that notification bell so you'll be notified when that video is in. And by the way, if you like this video, hit the like button there so that we can get a little more algorithm going on YouTube.
After you have determined what your must-haves are, and remember your list is prioritized, so the most important things to you are at the top of that list, you have to know something else before you even make a decision on what sort of backup power you are going to purchase and going to have on hand. That is, you have to know how much power you're actually looking to generate. To do that, you're going to add up literally the amount of watts that you have on that list plus the highest startup power. So you've got running power plus the highest startup power, and that's equal to the amount of watts that you need to supply in case of an emergency. Something you'll immediately find out, you probably can't run everything that you'd like to run all at once. And that's okay, but you need to figure out, which items you're going to have to plugged in at the same time, how you're going to rotate through those. The only way literally to figure out a game plan is to know what we just told you, and that is what your must-haves are, how many watts those must-have items use. That's your starting point, and that's going to let you know where you need to go from there.
The nice thing about using, let's say, a portable gas generator, the one that we have supplies about 3,500 watts, and that's not a lot of watts, but that's a pretty good amount to get us going. We would leave that plugged in permanently to our refrigerator and our freezer, and then we could take turns running the coffee maker, the microwave, washer, or dryer by simply unplugging something. What I would do is unplug the sump pump for a short period of time, since that has that surge wattage going on. I would unplug that and then plug in the microwave and use it. Then when I was done with the microwave, I'd plug the sump pump back in so that it was also draining water out of the basement. So you can rotate items around and get a little more use out of them.
And we are the first to admit that when it comes to cooking, when it comes to lighting, there's a number of these things we're talking about that, yes, you can do some of those things without actually using any electricity at all. A microwave may not be on your must-have and must-use list, and that's okay. We're merely supplying you with a list of suggestions, and you check off the items which are most important to your family, your must-haves. Now, Larry mentioned in this whole thing about figuring out how many watts each item uses. There is a device which we have consistently recommended that people have on hand, and that is a kilowatt meter, because that, my friend, is going to tell you how much wattage each item uses.
One of the things that Hope and I talked about where you can measure the wattage of any given item is using a kilowatt meter. And that's what this item is. You've seen us talk about it before if you've been watching us for a while. What you do with the kilowatt meter is you plug it in to line voltage, like so, and then you plug in the item that you want to test into the front there. And you can plug in more than one item if you need to know what a grouping of items are. You can do that as well. When you plug the kilowatt meter in, it defaults to line voltage. And I don't know if you can read that or not, probably not. Our line voltage is showing at 122 volts. So there's a button, there's several buttons on it. The middle button is for watts, and that's what I use the most. So I'm going to press that button, and it's going to show 0 right at the moment. It's showing 0 watts. So I'm going to put this fan on, and we're going to see what it draws for the different speeds. So this is speed 3, and it's using 82 watts. That's the fastest speed. The next speed down, it's using 72 watts, and on the low speed, it's using 64.3 watts. So that is exactly how you can tell what your items are using. This also has a feature of this with this red button on the end. It'll tell you what your kilowatt hours are. So that one you would leave plugged in over time, and that would tell you exactly how much your item is costing you to use. If you want to figure that out, as long as you know what that is on your bill, on your electric bill, you can actually figure out how much an item is costing you to run.
And once again, the bill is going to be in kilowatt hours. That's how you're going to be billed. Now, you've got your prioritized list. You know for your family how many watts of power you need to supply in case of a power outage. Now, speaking of power outages, one of the things Larry and I are really thinking about now, it starts going into cold weather and we start planning exactly what we're going to do in case of a cold weather power outage, kind of like our friends had in Virginia in January. We did a video on that and told you how you might want to supply some heat and some lights to your home in case of a winter power outage. If you're ready to watch that video and get ready for winter, then there's a link to it right over there, that video. You can watch that next.